Hey, happy Valentine's Day, everyone. Yep, that's right. It's that day that Cupid strings his bow, takes a shot at people, bam! You're hit by the love bug, and all of a sudden you're doing crazy things like pledging your lifelong love and devotion to someone you don't really know. And you know what? Generally, it works as long as you stick to the commitment. Today's a day you get to celebrate the irrational in life with sweets, candy, and reaching out to the people near and dear to you to tell them you love them. Unless you're Angry Dog. I don't see Angry Dog in the chat. Angry Dog's probably out nursing a pre-birthday hangover. Happy birthday to Angry Dog. I hear that you're 73 this year. That means you were born in 1951. That's a good year for minting humans. That's the year my life was born. So happy birthday, Angry Dog. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone else. But let me begin today by saying shame on you to the appellate division for the Second Judicial Department in New York. What the hell are you people smoking? Yesterday, for those of you who follow the weather, was a difficult day in the Northeast and in New England, at least southern New England and the mid-Atlantic states. Lots of snow. So the Supreme Court of the State of New York Appellate Division for the Second Judicial Department has a case, People versus Jelani Mirage. Jelani is the brother, as you will be happy to know, of Nicki Minaj, who I didn't know about until yesterday. I date myself. Apparently a wild, successful rapper. He's represented by Steve Metcalf. He's appealing an appellate issue. Steve calls me in the morning. We talk through the issues on appeal. We're ready to go. Steve's going to give him help, but he's stuck in snowbound traffic. What should I do? He tells me. I said, call the appellate court clerk. Tell him you're on your way. You may be a little bit late. My experience with appellate courts is they just want to know. Just don't be a no-show. So he does. He walks into court after being stuck in the snow, after informing the appellate clerk that he was having traffic-related issues, only to find out that they let his opponent argue against an empty chair. In other words, they deprived Steve and his client of the right to argue his case on appeal because Steve was stuck in traffic in the snow. I mean, what the hell are they smoking in New York City? Mean weed? In Connecticut, they closed the courts yesterday. They made a sensible decision. They took a look at the weather. They figured people are traveling, lives are on the line. We want people to come to court and be able fully to participate. Let's slow down. New York, they put the foot on the gas and they deprived a defendant's lawyer, an appellant's lawyer, the right to be heard because he was stuck in traffic, and the fellow called ahead to let him know it happened. Shame on the Second Division. Somebody get this to them. Ask them, what the hell were they thinking? Their job is to do justice, not to move widgets in the justice factory.
What was that? Do you know what the appellate issue was?
Yeah, but it had to do with a conviction involving sexual assault of a minor, and whether the rape shield statute was applicable. In this case, the state presented evidence that a hymen, the biological feature of the young woman's intimate parts, had been transected or broken, and they used that to argue that was circumstantial proof that it was broken by the defendant. The defendant denies any contact with her. In the course of discovery, it was learned that several other men had penetrated this child. The state precluded the defense from offering that evidence on the grounds of an application of what's called the rape shield statute. The rape shield statute basically says, even a prostitute can be raped. The fact that a person might have had an unchaste lifestyle up until the point of the sexual assault is no reason to introduce into evidence the lack of chastity. That would be prejudicial. A sexual assault is a one-on-one encounter between two people, and in this case, we're going to try this man for that assault, and we're not going to cloud the issues with evidence that this person may have had an unsavory lifestyle or whatnot. But the rape shield statute is, as the statute says, a shield. It is to protect the state's right to a fair trial, to protect a complaining witness against having his or her reputation trashed in a courtroom simply because on one occasion they were done wrong. But it's never supposed to be a sword. That's the difference between a shield and a sword. So if, in fact, the people of New York introduced evidence about a biological feature of this young victim. In other words, that her hymen had been broken. And suggested that the defendant was the one who broke it. The defendant had every right to argue, no, someone else may have. The state didn't have to choose to put that evidence on, and the state's entitled to a fair trial, not a perfect trial. The victim is entitled to application of the rape shield statute, but there's no such thing as the rape shield sword. Wherein the state gets to create inferences that are unsupported, perhaps by the full and more robust record, and then seek a conviction. So that's what Metcalf was going to argue tomorrow. And it may be that because of the prominence of the defendant's sister and the sordid nature of the charges, the court decided, hell, we'll give him some discount justice and hide behind his snowstorm. If so, shame on New York. That just it's really
rape sword statute has a glimmer of irony.
No kidding. Hey, so Mayorkas has been impeached. Last week, you will recall the House failed to vote articles of impeachment as to the Secretary of Homeland Security. This week they did, I guess by a one-vote margin, 214 to 213. And now Mayorkas's fate will go to the Senate. There's a lot of bizarre legal maneuvering being talked about in the press. The story in the New York Sun reports that at least one legal scholar says, well, the Senate may not have to hold a trial after all, because, the word shall, when the impeachment clause says once a person is impeached by the House, they shall be tried in the Senate. The word shall is doing a lot of work there. I don't know who this knucklehead is, but if you learn one thing in law school about statutory construction or the construction of laws, you learn that there's a huge difference between the words may, which is permissive, and shall, which is mandatory. Yes, shall is doing a lot of work. If the House votes articles of impeachment, the Senate shall, which means must, hold a trial. To somehow pocket veto the proceedings because you don't like the fact that the House impeached this cabinet member is irresponsible. And any lawyer who suggests that shall is a permissive term isn't a lawyer I would rely on for anything, even the defense of a parking ticket. Mayorkas becomes the first cabinet member impeached for 150 years. And don't ask me who the last one was. I frankly don't know. I should have if I was going to make that statement, and we'll report it later in the week. But he faces charges that he was derelict in his enforcement of the nation's immigration laws. Critics of the impeachment say, well, we're talking about political policy judgments. These aren't high crimes and misdemeanors within the meaning of the law. This is an election year stunt in a year in which immigration reform is likely to play an outsized role in the minds of voters. I think the critics are probably right there.
I believe the last sitting cabinet member to be impeached was former President Andrew Johnson in 1868.
What cabinet post did he occupy at that point?
I think, is he not, let's see, if it's not him, is he not a member of his own cabinet?
But we've had, we've had other presidents impeached since then. I don't know. Let's dig into that a little more deeper, or maybe, maybe it's me again will do it, or one of the folks on the Rumble chat, which has some really brilliant researchers on there. So Mayorkas will go. He's likely not to be removed from office, and the immigration debate will continue. It's not. The standard for impeachment is high crimes and misdemeanors. If you refuse to enforce a law, are you derelict in your duty? I suppose. Although I'm not persuaded, even though I think immigration is a huge problem. I'm loving the fact that Garland is in the hot squad for his appointment of Mr. Hur and Hur's publication of the report on the decision not to prosecute Joe Biden for retention of national security records after he left the vice presidency. As we discussed yesterday, I don't really think Biden should have been prosecuted. I think his conduct is altogether different from that of Trump's. I think that the investigation of Biden, and if you read the Hur report, it's hard to come away with the conclusion that we brought this problem on ourselves by overclassifying documents and making it almost impossible for those who have participated in shaping historical events to write meaningful memoirs. But apparently now Democrats are wound up saying that Garland appointed a partisan hack, and that Herr's comments about Biden and his memory were gratuitous. I don't think they were gratuitous. They're obvious. Turn on the television sometime and watch Joe speak to the nation. If you don't see your crabby old Uncle Bob or your grandfather there asking for some more sugar for his oatmeal, I don't know what you're seeing. But I'm all over Garland because, again, he has superintended what I will call a jihad with respect to January 6th and the prosecution of those who participated in a riot. Just yesterday, there were a couple more convictions in front of Judge Moss. It was the Middleton couple. I'm not sure their first name, but they ran something called the Patriot Relief Fund. And so Judge Moss, has received guilty verdicts, has remanded these people temporarily to custody, and is now going to decide whether to hold them until sentencing. Merrick Garland has got hundreds more prosecutions of J6 defendants up his sleeve. I suspect people will be arrested even in the height of the presidential campaign. And what am I talking about? The post-Labor Day period, when people's attention is really drawn to politics. Right now, just political junkies follow it. After Labor Day, everybody gets serious. And we're still prosecuting people for their participation in a riot that lasted 4 or 5 hours on January 6, 2021. Merrick Garland has got a screw loose, and he's got to go. Send him and Joe on a trip to Fantasy Island, but make it a one-way trip, and don't let them return. It's too much and enough already.
This Vanity Fair article is really interesting as well on the point. You and I have been really vocal critics of Attorney General Merrick Garland. You outwardly so, and throughout the prosecution of the Proud Boys defendants in the January 6th seditious conspiracy trials. But as you just discussed, he's got hundreds more up his sleeve. But this article is interesting because it talks of the, I guess, distaste for Garland based on allegations that he didn't move quickly enough on the prosecution of Trump. And also that the article also talks about the fact that Democrats tend to be so focused on this illusion, or not illusion maybe, but trying to appear as impartial, that they make decisions about personnel within the ranks that yield positions to people who are highly partisan. And in this case, they're attacking Special Counsel Robert Hur for being far too conservative, and that being to blame for the report that was generated just now about President Biden and the lack of available information to bring prosecution, saying that Attorney General Merrick Garland should have reviewed and edited the report before it came out.
Well, I actually agree with that. Her, I think, had to explain to an incredulous public perhaps, why not prosecute Biden while Trump is being prosecuted. And so I think a report of some sort was necessary. But his subjective evaluation of how Biden might appear to the jury as a frail, elderly old man with a poor memory, that was kind of gratuitous. And I'm not sure it was necessary. I'm not sure it supports the narrative that has blossomed online, that this is proof that Biden is incompetent and let's dust off the 25th Amendment and get him out of there. I mean, basically, it is what it is. He's an 81-year-old guy who'd lose his way on his way to the refrigerator, right?
I agree. Again, is anybody reading the report in full? Even
those who are
complaining about sort of the narrative out in the public, that seemed like the easier way to inoculate against the criticism is to just read the report. But reading is tough.
Rumor has it that in the Biden household, Jill gets up at night and puts Post-it notes from the bedroom to the refrigerator. This way, dear, this way to the midnight snack. Hey, Dawn, thanks for the history lesson. Bill Wellknapp, 1876 war secretary, was impeached. Didn't know that. I'll be looking into that later in the day.
It's me again on Rumble also. I think she was quicker on the uptake than Dawn, but Dawn is using YouTube, and YouTube is what can be put on the screen here for comments far easier than Rumble. So I wanted to acknowledge it's me again as well.
So I don't know, Mike, talk to what's up with the Senate? I mean, 70 votes in favor of aid to Ukraine. You know, I'm still puzzling over the Vladimir Putin interview that Tucker Carlson did. We talked briefly about it yesterday. Then the takeaway I have is that Putin is worth listening to because Putin has an interest and the Russian people have an interest in defending their presence in the world and defending their national interest. And one of their interests is not being overtaken, overwhelmed, overshadowed, or intimidated by the West. And I accept that as a given. And I think that the use of Ukraine and NATO to suggest that the West somehow has to counter Russian expansionism in the name of what exactly, to the tune of tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives, and potentially American lives, is just not a case that Biden has made or anybody in the Democrat Party has made convincingly. I think one can say no to aid to Ukraine without being accused of isolationism. One just simply has to respect the fact that in a multipolar world, there are different nations with different spheres of influence. And Russia is an ancient empire, an ancient nation, an ancient entity that with roots going back more than 1,000 years, and it has had a series of border and regional conflicts with its neighbors, and the West is encroaching. I was persuaded when Putin looked at Tucker and said, "Don't you people have better things to do than worry about a border problem thousands of miles from your own home at a point when you can't control your own borders and you've got a national debt spiraling out of control?" So I suspect that this aid package will founder in the House. I candidly hope it does. Nobody has yet made a compelling case to me, at least that I have heard, that it is in American interest to go all in on the Ukraine. For the sake of what?
Well, this all seems tied together, right? So I kept the Mayorkas impeachment stuff on the screen here because most clearly the issue that Americans care about most is that of immigration and that of the lack of security and enforcement of existing border laws on our southern border, and the fact that the funding that was tied up into the security bill that has been rejected or is being rejected in the House did more for funding the war in Ukraine, more for funding aid and support to Israel than it did did on the southern border, and how that money would be allocated. Not to mention the fact that the money that was earmarked for the southern border has been reported on by numerous other outlets, was not in fact support to enforce existing border laws to preclude the incursion of mass number of migrants on the southern border, but rather to staff additional judges, additional patrol agents, etc., for the processing of immigrants and migrants across the southern border, some of which would be granted asylum status without actual due process, without actually going in front of a judge if that border bill were to have been ratified. A number of various poison pills within that bill, with the expectation that Trump regains the White House in November, that he would be obligated to continue funding Ukraine lest he be impeached by violating that bill being sent through. Right. So the controversy about that bill and about what's going on in the Senate now, just passing this sort of naked funding bill that has nothing to do with the border, is political football, right? Not that we are incapable of pointing that stuff out, or that we should get too bogged down in the weeds with that. But the point of all of this is symbolically someone needs to be held to account for the lack of enforcement on the border. Congress has finally made a move, albeit 214 to 213, to at least prove that point to the American public, those who aren't necessarily paying attention to the finer nuances of federal border and immigration law, the lack of enforcement, the 10th Amendment sort of federalism issue as it exists between the federal government and the state of Texas, the various states and National Guards being deployed toward that effort. The issue is simply this: that the federal executive branch has shown not only that it is more than willing to use that executive power without and sort of abrogate the role of Congress in so doing. I mean, all we have to do, and I've said this before, go back to the earliest days of President Biden's term, and it was executive order after executive order after executive order after executive order, without any regard for whether those executive orders would survive scrutiny within the courts and be overturned in time, which they obviously were. Many of those executive orders have been overturned, and then even on issues as simple as student loan debt and sort of these forgiveness programs and stuff like that. I just find it highly disingenuous for the establishment in the federal executive branch to talk about how this bill is somehow necessary to control the crisis on our southern border. That's just it's gaslighting at the highest level, right? We talked about the issue between Texas and the federal government, with respect to the federal government basically saying that, because the border is far enough back from the actual territorial line, that these barricades, that migrants are actually in American territory by the time they're encountering these barricades, and as such, they are to be provided with certain rights and remedies. And sort of just these technicalities that we keep getting lost in. The reality is we've got millions and millions of people crossing the border. A funding bill for something like Ukraine is just curious, right? The total commitment to funding a war in Ukraine, and especially in the wake of the interview between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin, it's interesting to me that our Congress would be willing to tie the hands of a future president. And this is important, Norm, because the other night there was a Spaces on X, and Vivek Ramaswamy participated along with, I think, Senator Mike Lee, and JD Vance may have been involved. I can't remember if Vance was involved, but he was extraordinary thinking on this topic of how important perhaps the tranching funding for Ukraine would be for a negotiation. And he said unequivocally, I don't support earmarking funds for Ukraine. But if we look at it practically, right, in light of this interview with Putin and him seeming to come to the table to say that he's willing to negotiate, how important that tool would be for whoever the president is in November, to be able to use that as a bargaining chip in de-escalating the war in Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
Being able to take funding off of the table and say, we will stop funding, right? We can commit to these various things, including we will not fund the war further from here. But the fact that funding would be tied to that immigration enforcement and these other items kind of blows me away, right? Or we're not even really playing to win, or our Congress, our elected leaders, and our president and that administration are playing to win a different game than that of the American people.
That may be. I mean, the notion of global norms, global imperatives, and somehow a decline of respect for national sovereignty or populism, it remains a fault line in American politics. Just to round out the Ukraine discussion in American interest, I got to thinking how, remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? We were very wound up when the Soviets put nuclear or weapons in Cuba, and rightly so. They were right on our border. A silent part of the agreement for them to withdraw those was that we remove our missiles from Turkey, close to Russia. So there's always been a sense of respect for borders and nearness to borders. I don't think the United States should be spending billions of dollars to disturb a border dispute near Russia, any more than I think necessarily the United States should be all in with respect to Taiwan. Spoiler alert, I'm reading a fun book. Couldn't put it down last night. 2034 by Admiral James Stavridis. I got lured into it by a review in Wired that talked about a book, about a situation in which an American president died, but nobody knew because of AI. That's 2054, the sequel to 2034. So but go ahead and read this, because it talks about a world war emerging over United States and China fighting about passageways in the South Pacific Sea, and about Taiwan's relationship to China. Can we afford and American foreign policy that has us committed everywhere in the world all at once. You know, Kennedy once said we would bear any burden, any cost, any consequence to defend liberty everywhere. You know, I'm not sure that we're prepared to honor that commitment any longer. There's a wonderful line in the Stavridis novel that explained the lassitude in American foreign policy, at least fictively at this time. The America that we believe ourselves to be is no longer the America that we are. So keep an eye on the Ukraine crisis. It's interesting. Hey, you know,
before we leave this, check out what I put on the screen. I was searching for this while you were talking just now. Cernovich tweeted, I think yesterday, it may be just a tad bit older than yesterday. It's February 12th, so 2 days ago, late at night. Did you know 650,000 Ukrainian men fled the country as they didn't see a point to the war? Regime officials have to kidnap men left in Ukraine as no one wants to fight. The average age of a soldier is nearly 50. An entire generation of young men was sent to slaughter. And I think that this is something that started making its rounds. I saw that Mark Randazza actually quoted this and said that this single tweet and the linked information gave him a perspective that he previously did not have, that if there was an unwillingness or a general unwillingness within the fighting age men of Ukraine at the time that the war was ramping up to the tune of 650,000 men illegally immigrating into in parts of Western Europe, right, to avoid fighting in the war. What is it that we're actually funding?
Good question. And you know, maybe it is BlackRock and others. Hey, so do real men drink Bud Light? I think Junior Coltrane wants to know, and I know you've got plenty on your mind about Bud Light. And we've been wanting to talk about this for a while. Air it out, Mike. What's going on?
Yeah, and I'll talk more about this in the newsletter that is coming today. I promise it's coming today.
What? We didn't send it yesterday? No wonder my mailbox was empty. I wanted to know what I was thinking last week. I couldn't remember because I've got Bushitis.
Last week, President Trump put this out on his Truth Social, and I'll read just for a moment here, and then I'll give my position on this. But the Bud Light ad was a mistake of epic proportions, and for that, a very big price was paid. But Anheuser-Busch is not a woke company, but I can give you plenty that are, and building a list, and I might just release it for the world to see. Why not? The radical left does it viciously to well-run conservative companies and people. Very nasty, but it's the way they play the game. On the other hand, Anheuser-Busch spends $700 million a year with our great farmers and employs 65,000 Americans, of which 1,500 are veterans, and is a founding corporate partner of Folds of Honor, which provides scholarships for families of fallen servicemen and women. They've raised over $30 million and given 44,000 scholarships. Anheuser-Busch is a great American brand that perhaps deserves a second chance. What do you think? Perhaps instead we should be going after those companies that are looking to destroy America. And he goes a bit further into sort of the woke versus non-woke, the political football that is that has become of this issue. But Norm, you well know that that the business of beer is what I started my professional career in and on, right?
Mike, are you telling me you're a beer booster?
I started a practice called Carolina Craft Legal directly out of law school, and it has been my job over the last 9 or so years to know as much as physically possible about the value chain, that is the transformation of raw ingredients into a consumer product that is shipped and sold to the consuming public all over America. And yes, Anheuser-Busch is a multinational corporation. In fact, Anheuser-Busch is a global company, right? Bud Light, for example, is the same here in Greensboro, North Carolina, as it is in Bangkok, Thailand. And when we think about, you know, sort of this bloodthirst, this yearning for, I don't know if it's an apology or just harm, economic harm and otherwise, to befall a company entirely because of the mistake of a brand, right? That is Bud Light. I think that too few people understand where I'm coming from when I say Trump is right here. And maybe my referencing Trump is a concurrence, but the problem is simply this, Norm. To harm Anheuser-Busch, which we have as a consumer base, as citizens, we have really harmed them pretty bad. In fact, their Q3 2023 press release reported a net revenue decline in the United States of 13.5%. And that
Wow.
meant that almost 18% decline in their shipments to wholesalers, almost a 17% decline in their shipments to retailers, which means that in order to hurt Anheuser-Busch, you must first hurt the rest of the value chain, because beer flows just like this: production, wholesale, retail. And beer, Bud Light, is a lot of the American market. In fact, the brand Bud Light is double that of Miller and Coors, respectively, in terms of market share and volume sold. Think about that and we're talking about tens of millions of barrels of
But
product.
every time, if I were to pick up a Bud Light, I'd still feel like I was shaking hands with Dylan Mulvaney, and that's not something I want to do. So how
You
does
know,
Bud get over that?
So what Bud is doing, and what they will continue to do, and what they've had to do, is extend credit to wholesalers. They've actually had to buy back product, give discounts. They're funding all sorts of efforts, regenerative efforts for branding and whatever else. But what I'm telling you is that what has happened over the last, it was April of 23, so maybe 9 or 10 months, is that wholesalers all over the country, because beer is a 3-tier system, every single state mandates that a brewery must use an in-state licensed wholesaler to get its product into the retail market. And each of these wholesalers has exclusivity as to the territory and the brands that they distribute into these territories, meaning that there is a funnel by law from a regulatory perspective that means that all product is basically separated into red and blue houses, right? Miller versus Bud, all over the country. And if you are a Bud house, meaning that you're a red house, your portfolio is almost probably 60 to 70% Bud products.
Hmm.
But these people, these wholesalers, these men and women that get up every day and distribute these products into the market, are quite populist by nature, right-leaning by nature. They are blue-collar workers. And so when I talk about the fact that AB InBev is hurting economically, and they are having to extend buybacks and credit, they are doing fuel reimbursements and shipping reimbursements, all sorts of economic initiatives to essentially float that market. They've acknowledged that they really, really, really made a mistake of epic proportions. But for the rest of us out here to be advocating for the decline of one single supplier brand, Bud Light, that may change in time. But these people who are out there are losing their jobs. Wholesalers are laying people off. Retailers have exorbitant amounts
Are
of
you
product
listening, Junior Coltrane? Are you
already,
listening?
right? It doesn't matter if you don't like the beer. What I'm saying is that from a holistic perspective, to take aim at Bud Light in the way that we're taking aim is to also, and by implication, ruin the livelihoods of all of those that politically and otherwise probably agree with you on the issues of free speech, the Second Amendment, the right to privacy, the southern border, sort of the issues of corruption, etc., that exist in the halls of government. We are actually cutting our nose to spite our face. So Trump is 100% correct. Bud Light made a mistake that they will continue paying for well into this year. And I will make sure I link to the Form 6K. I will link to the press release, and I'll link to other things that can give better color to what I'm talking about. But for those who are looking for some sort of body to stomp on or teeth to put on a necklace and wear around your neck, you've already got it. All right.
All right.
But that's my point. And again, I don't find a whole lot of quarter within the beer industry for waving my hand and trying to protect, the Borg, big beer. However, that is not a vacuum that we are capable of filling here in America, and few people understand what it takes to actually get to scale. So
You
anyway,
have won over Junior Coltrane. I do agree. It's time to let Bud Light off with a hard lesson learned. I appreciate the pushback, Mike. I'm not a big beer drinker. I would have avoided Bud Light just because of my distaste for the woke agenda. But you raise a good point. Maybe it is time to have a Bud Light and say this one's for you, to the hardworking men and women who get their livelihood from it and whose management made a horrible mistake and are paying for it now. Let's welcome it back into the economic marketplace. Hey, on the topic of mismanagement, while we're talking, the New York Post wrote a piece about turbulence in RFK Jr.'s presidential campaign. Am I the only person who had a time warp experience during the Super Bowl? I'm watching the game. It's late. My eyes are glazed over during the commercials, and all of a sudden, in the back of my mind, I hear Kennedy for president, Kennedy this, Kennedy that. And I look up and it looks like a 1960s campaign ad. And I'm thinking, is this from the Histories Channel? And, are we going back to JFK? It was a RFK ad. And I think it was a deliberate ploy to kind of reawaken an association with John F. Kennedy. But apparently his presidential campaign is in the tank. Staffers are fleeing because he spends too much and he's got poor leadership. So RFK may think he's an alternative, but he's got to lead his own house better if he expects to try to run the United States government. And who knows where that campaign is going to go. But I don't know if anybody else was sort of seduced by that ad into an historic reverie. I'd like to watch the ad again.
I remember watching it and thinking that it was brilliant timing, and it was totally undone because RFK comes out later and is like, "Hey, I didn't have anything to do with that." And it's like, okay, it was good though.
Yeah, and you get the impression that RFK was the Greta Thunberg or of the Kennedy family. Oh, he's not quite right, but he's got the Kennedy brand. RFK, come back to us, buddy. We need alternatives. You might be it, but you might not.
Yeah, I think he had some sort of like TikTok faux pas as well. I don't know if you saw the news about that last week, where something came out about a comment that was made from the TikTok account that's now RFK's TikTok account. And it was, commenting like the heart eyes on a, I guess, a picture or a video of somebody showing their ass. And we learned that the account had been transferred from an RFK staffer to RFK because RFK is starting a brand new account, didn't have a sufficient number of followers in order to take advantage of like the live features and these other things that you need to run a campaign. But thereby is sort of like, basically taking on the liabilities of past social media activity of that same account, rather than leaning into it. He was just like, "Hey, do you think I so-and-so, was commenting on this in April of 22 or whatever it may have been." My problem now is that he keeps kind of making these unforced errors. Things kind of go his way and give him reason to be back in the limelight, give him opportunities to earn a share of votes, and to keep making this election more complicated. And he, for whatever reason, is like kind of stumbling over himself. Like I said, I remember sitting there during the Super Bowl watching that ad and thinking, "Wow, well done. That was an exceptional ad." And it wasn't that, that Jesus ad, Jesus washed feet and, da 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 kind of thing where you're just kind of made uncomfortable.
Jesus got this. Yeah,
it was a really, really good salient ad. And then he comes out and says, "Well, I didn't have anything to do with that." It's like, just shut up. Just shut up.
He's an oddball. I tried to read his book on COVID and Fauci, and he went well beyond the data and got mean and attributed motives to them. And as always, whenever we talk about them, I wonder who they are and why we are attributing agency to forces we can't name, and whether we're simply taking the coward's way out by demonizing something we don't like. Life is hard, and the ability to meet the challenges that you face on their own terms requires a constant application of intelligence and stamina. And we all fail in the end at the margins just because we're tired. But making a career out of demonizing them just doesn't work for me.
Mike, we're trying to get out of here. Hold on a second. Pete Atkinson is in the chat, so I got to get my point.
Oh, Pete Atkinson. I got the Pete Atkinson and the Merry Beggars. They're working on a piece on St. Augustine. I got wind of this last night. Pete, you are my idol. I found out about this last night. I went to bed thinking about it, and I thought that's the answer. That's the answer to that age-old question. If you could have dinner with any one person who's ever lived, who would it be? And I would pick St. Augustine. Now you're saying, well, why not Jesus? Augustine was well read in the classics and in a world that I appreciate, and he managed to find satisfaction for his spiritual longings in the gospel of Christ as understood through the prism provided by the classics. St. Augustine, I would walk on hot coals to have dinner with that man. And you know what? Pete Atkinson and the Merry Beggars are going to do the next best thing. They're going to produce a special on St. Augustine. keep an eye out for it, folks. I didn't mean to cut you off, Mike, but I just, when I hear St. Augustine, it's like I'm at the casino. Bing, 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 bing. All the lights go off. That's a guy I want to know.
I know we'll be pushing that, but he does ask. He says, "I'm a little confused. Are you saying that it hurts them because it causes overall beer sales to go down?" Indeed, I'm saying that the boycott on the brand of Bud Light, because of how over-indexed that brand is by comparison to every other beer product in the market, because of how the volume of that beer, and because the suppliers manufacture the beer, but the lag time between sales and manufacturing the beer is so great that you've got wholesalers all over the country that have indexed on years and historical data that says the velocity of sales are going to be this, and these types of outlets, these price points are the most competitive and the most sensitive. You got chain retailers. Think about the Wegmans, Target, any sort of big Harris Teeter or Whole Foods, whatever. Every grocery store in the country, every C-store in the country, every bar in the country that is not sort of a craft beer centric place is, in the on-premise, as we call it, has Bud Light on draft. The fact that everybody is making purchasing decisions and tying up their capital, and then there's this earthquake that occurs further up the value chain with the supplier, with the brand. It attacks the credibility and the reputation of that brand. You've got massive capital outlays already, and then nothing to actually substitute into those wholesale and retail channels that give these businesses viability based on the business plans that have been written for the last 50 or 60 years. So yes, I'm saying that yes, overall beer sales going down of that, and that's why I referenced the statistics that in Q3 of 2023, there was a 17.6% drop in shipments to wholesalers alone across the board for AB InBev in America. It's a massive amount of beer.
Don McNeil, Augustine was more horny than Jesus also. Well, we don't know that Jesus was horny. That may be extra biblical. But we do know a lot about Augustine. And for those of you who want to know more about St. Augustine, take a look at Peter Brown's biography of him, one of the best biographies I've ever written. Dawn, I'm sure you've read it. That's how you know about Augustine's lustful ways. But you also learned that Augustine was able to turn away from desire for things and instead focus on his desire for righteousness and knowledge of God. The Confessions remains the most moving piece of autobiographical writing, one of the most moving in Western literature, and I commend it to all of you. Mike, we did it. We talked for 42 minutes and 30 seconds. That's a little bit longer than usual. Are you tired?
Hornier, or do you need this would be a great t-shirt.
What's that?
Hornier than Jesus would be a great t-shirt.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, folks, for tuning in. I think we'll be back tomorrow. It's certainly our aspiration. That is, if I don't freeze to death. It's 8 degrees up here in the Northeast Kingdom. Winds blowing in gusts of up to 30, according to my weather app, making it feel like -9 below. It's cold out there. I think it's going to be a pretty good day to put some logs on the fire and crank up the wood stove and work on the Proud Boys brief. What are you going to be doing today, Mike?
Working, working.
I'm going to work because I'm a crumb. What do you had to ask? What do you think I'm going to be doing?
Working. No, we'll be back tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. on X, YouTube, and on Rumble. Thank you to everybody on Rumble. That chat is very lively today. And then, the newsletter will be coming out today. You've got a couple of pieces in there of what we're reading. And I will promise to just keep my thoughts brief here on this Bud Light topic, but at least give people something to chew on and understand.
Something to sip. You don't chew on Bud Light. What the hell's the matter with you? Mixed metaphor.
Chew on hops. All right. Anyway, I'll see you in the morning. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Ciao.